From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The Michigan primary results show political dangers for both Donald Trump and Joe Biden, as the Supreme Court hears a case on whether the administrative state can unilaterally ban rifle accessories called bump stocks. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. With a week to go until Super Tuesday, where 874 Republican delegates will be at stake, the candidates made a pit stop this week in Michigan for primaries there. And Kim, to my eye, there's some points of vulnerability for each of these candidates in the results that we are now parsing. Let's start with Donald Trump. Here's the result from the Michigan Republican primary. Trump with 68% of the vote, Nikki Haley with about 27%, Uncommitted with 3%, and then about 2% for Ron DeSantis, Chris Christie, Vivek Ramaswamy, and other dropout candidates. But remarkable to me, Kim, that it's pretty clear by now that Donald Trump's lead in this Republican primary is all but insurmountable. And yet still going into this primary, Nikki Haley is above a quarter of the vote, and Donald Trump is barely above 2/3.
Yes. And if you talk to the Trump campaign, they'll make the argument that those numbers that he's showing in these primaries, these early primaries, are in fact well above what they were when he ran back in 2016. And they'll say that he consolidated support nonetheless when it finally came time to have that convention. And obviously, by the time it came for everybody to go vote, he did indeed have a lot of the Republican Party's base. Does that translate to this time around, given that people have now experienced him in office? Some people really do seem to be turned off by him. You have a number of polls suggesting that those who are voting against him now, significant proportions of them say that they would also view him as not fit for office if he was ultimately convicted of one of the crimes that he has been charged with. So I do think that it's certainly a different circumstance, and he's going to have to do, I think, some more work to try to get Republicans on board with this candidacy.
But notable to me, Mene, that Trump continues underperforming his polling. So there was a poll out earlier this week from Emerson College that showed the Republican primary result being 76% Trump to 24% Haley. There was another poll earlier this month from Morning Consult that suggested it was 79% to 19%. And again, those are polls of the Michigan Republican primary. And the final result that we have now is off that by something like 8 or 10 points. And so if you look at polls showing in November that President Trump is 2 or 4 points ahead of Joe Biden, I start to wonder how confident the GOP really feels in those polling results. And I agree with Kim that the job of Donald Trump right now should be to be reaching out to those Nikki Haley voters, trying to reassure them about what he would do in office, how he would govern in a second term, and trying to win them over. And he seems to almost revel in doing the opposite and continuing to antagonize her supporters.
Right. Well, on the question of Trump underperforming the polling in a lot of these primaries, there are a couple possible explanations for that. One is a longstanding Trump effect in polling, which is a theory floated mostly by his supporters, which is that a lot of Trump supporters realize how unpopular he is in the eyes of the mainstream media and in the eyes of his detractors, and are afraid to suggest that they actually are going to vote for Trump in the end. And so the composition of some of these polls can sometimes be inconsistent with the feelings of actual voters. But on the other hand, there could be a more palpable practical problem that Trump is facing in terms of actually energizing his voters to come out to the ballot box because he has such a commanding lead. It's possible that people are being called by a pollster and saying that they support Trump and that they're likely voters, but at the end of the day, they're so confident in his victory that if anything comes up in their day, they're not necessarily going to follow through with their plan to spend a couple hours going to actually cast that vote. But either way, it is very clear that Trump definitely is not doing the kind of outreach that you're describing to the moderate voters in the Republican Party who have some hesitancy about his candidacy. He is focused on turnout, holding rallies that are aimed directly at his most loyal supporters, contacting them online and trying to get them energized about himself and the possibility of coming back to office and reliving the experiences that made them so enthusiastic about him in the first place. I don't think that he thinks it's possible to win over voters who aren't already in his camp, and he doesn't think it's worth his effort to do that. And so that's dangerous because he's going to need the support of every Republican-affiliated voter in order to go into the general election. And this is the period of time when he could be doing some of that outreach. But he's confident enough that I'm always going to have above 50% support in every primary, and I don't need to really focus on expanding my coalition right now.
Let's turn to President Joe Biden. There had been an organized effort by pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli voters to cast a ballot for uncommitted in the Democratic primary as a way to send a message to Joe Biden about his Israel policy. And let's listen to Governor Gretchen Whitmer explaining yesterday why she thinks Biden can win those voters back in November.
This is a state that it's always close elections. There is a sense of urgency. And, as I've engaged with Michiganders of, various backgrounds, I know that this is a high concern. It is re-traumatizing for so many people who've come to Michigan or their ancestors came to Michigan to flee violence like they see playing out on TikTok halfway around the world every day. It is re-traumatizing. So I think it's going to be important that, the administration continue to engage with leaders and individuals in the Palestinian community, the Muslim community, the Arab American community, as well as the Jewish community.
Kim, the final result there is 81% for Joe Biden, 13% for uncommitted, 3% for Marianne Williamson, and about 3% for Dean Phillips. But notable that uncommitted ballot line attracted more than 100,000 votes, and that compares with about 150,000 votes that Joe Biden won Michigan by in 2020.
Yeah, and the supporters and organizers of this uncommitted vote drive had said that their benchmark was 10,000, that they felt that if they had registered that they were sending a message. Now, that was pretty low. Interestingly, Michigan primaries often do tend to turn up uncommitted votes in some sizable numbers. If you look back at the last three primaries have had 10,000 votes or more. In fact, in 2012, Barack Obama was running with no opponent, and there was 21,000 people in Michigan who nonetheless voted uncommitted. But this number, nonetheless, is very big, 101,000 people. Trump won the state by 11,000 votes in 2016. Biden, as you said, more than 100,000 in 2020. But note, too, that these are only Democrats who are registering their discontent. It doesn't count for independents, for instance, and others that might also have concerns about this war, or other reasons that they are not thrilled that Joe Biden is their nominee. And I think that's why Michigan is actually garnering so much attention, is because it's the first swing state in all of these primaries that we've had. And so it's raising a lot of alarms about both candidates and their prospects in a general election. Joe Biden, we were just talking about Donald Trump, but Joe Biden, this is actually even more concerning for him because these are people that he's already in office. He is cruising for the nomination, and they are making it clear not just that they aren't going to vote for him in this primary, but they're sending a very clear message. And that's what the organizers said, is that these people are going to stay home in a general election.
Hang tight. We'll be right back with more on this in a moment. Welcome back. Before the break, Kim put her finger on what I think is so interesting about this Democratic primary result, because a lot of these votes for uncommitted seem to be in areas you would expect if this is a vote against Joe Biden's Israel policy. But then again, a lot of these votes don't seem to be in those areas. So Kent County, that is Grand Rapids, Michigan, 14% went for uncommitted there. Kalamazoo County, 13% for uncommitted. Marquette County, 12% uncommitted. And so, Monet, I wonder how much of that vote is not a protest against Joe Biden's Israel policy, but other Democrats who are given pause about 4 more years of Joe Biden for other reasons, including his age. We've talked on the program about the polling showing that most voters think that Joe Biden is too old. He is going in today for his annual physical to Walter Reed, but there is no word yet from the White House about whether that will include any sort of cognitive testing.
Right. Let's not forget that the worries about the direction of Biden's presidency within the Democratic Party started long before October 7th and his policy toward Israel. We have seen really since 2022, Democrats, particularly office holders and particularly Democratic elites, openly expressing worry about President Biden's age and his fitness. There has been a gradual increase in the number of public incidents of him forgetting things, stumbling, that have made the public worry about whether or not he has the stamina for the 2024 re-election campaign, not to talk of 4 more years in office, and also the direction of his policies. There are a lot of Democrats who believe that, particularly on issues like the border, he just hasn't shown the ability to actually govern in a way that sort of holds their confidence. And so there have been people searching for an alternative for quite some time. And it was always an open question how much voters in the Democratic Party shared these worries that were being expressed by liberal journalists and Democratic office holders. The primaries are giving us our first chance to actually test that. And what we are seeing is exactly what you suggested. It's not only Arab Americans who are worried about Biden's Israel policy, but there is a sizable chunk in some of these even rural and suburban counties around the state of Michigan who cast uncommitted votes, suggesting that they are open to an alternative to Biden if somebody other than Dean Phillips were to raise their hand and potentially get in. So we'll see as the primary contest continues on whether that's consistent or whether Michigan stands out in that regard. But either way, President Biden can't be confident about the support he has within the Democratic Party voter base right now.
Kim, the political problems faced by each of these major party candidates brings us to what might be the most underplayed news of Tuesday, which is that the super PAC that is supporting Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for president says it has gotten enough signatures now to get him on the ballot as an independent candidate in 2 big swing states, Arizona and Georgia. And the super PAC also says that they're about 75% of the way to the signature target to get on the ballot in Michigan. And so you could have another option that voters would be considering when they go into the ballot booth in November. That's part of what makes this election so difficult to analyze and handicap is it's hard to know which side of the aisle Robert F. Kennedy Jr. takes votes from more. And that's before we throw in the idea of a potential no labels candidate, which is also being circulated.
Yes. And by the way, RFK, it looks as though he had qualified already for the Utah and New Hampshire and Hawaii ballots. But what's really getting attention here, as you note, is that these are 2 swing states. And if you look at polls, and we haven't seen any in a while, but there were some polls from last fall showing him pulling a sizable number of votes in those states next to both Trump and Biden. And what does that mean? Because one thing that's just interesting here is, look, we've had some very, very close elections recently when it comes to the electoral count vote. And this doesn't just have the potential to maybe swing this race one way or the other in a Joe Biden or a Donald Trump direction. But I mean, goodness, it seems unlikely still. But if you had a no labels team or you had an RFK candidacy that did well enough in just 1 state or 2 states or states where they have different ways of proportioning delegates, could you end up in a situation where no one had 270? I mean, there's all kinds of potential. I think that both parties, by the way, are creating for themselves with these candidates who really have just not sold themselves to the majority of their parties. And that is really very much leaving open the possibility of a more successful third-party run than we have seen in a while. I would note that this is obviously very much concerning Democrats. And in fact, the Democratic National Committee recently filed an FEC complaint against the RFK campaign, alleging that its super PAC was engaging in illegal coordination with the campaign over some of this work for ballot access. We'll see where that goes. But this is alarming enough to DC insiders that people are now trying to derail the RFK campaign, as it were.
Another X factor is we don't know whether no labels will get on the ballot or where it will be on the ballot or even who its candidate might be. Joe Manchin has said that he's not running for president. No Labels expressed some interest in Nikki Haley, but I don't think she is going to go that route. And so we don't really know who they would even put up for this. But the most recent Harvard-Harris poll, here's the question. If Trump was the Republican nominee and Biden the Democratic nominee, would you consider an independent moderate candidate running for the presidency? 56% of voters, Monet, say yes.
Yeah, again, I think that that's an inevitable consequence of the dissatisfaction with both of these candidates. Interestingly enough, RFK very much is not in the mold of what the No Labels platform is looking for, which is essentially a more traditional establishmentarian type who would be able to synthesize popular views from both of the parties, looking for someone who, for example, would pursue a comprehensive immigration reform package, securing the border while also enhancing pathways to legal immigration, moderation on issues like abortion, taxation, trying to bridge the middle, whereas RFK is more of building a popular following among more populist-inclined voters who are skeptical of the public health regime, have concerns about trade and a few other longstanding issues that I think some populist people feel have not been addressed by either party. But I do think that the possibility of a viable third-party candidacy is obviously increasing. The question is, when you go from that theoretical place of someone who is between Trump and Biden in terms of their political approach to picking a specific person, will it be able to hold up, and will that person really have any success chipping away at the lead or of one or the other candidate in some of these swing states? And so all of that's yet to be determined, but we're going to start moving from a kind of theoretical anticipation of a third-party run into looking at exactly who that might be and how it's going to affect the general election if the current trend holds.